Hello, and welcome to Voice the SASHA PoSHcast, your go-to podcast for all things posh. I am your host, Shweta Bhatt, and the theme for this month is PoSH for Transgender Employees. Now, before we begin, some of you might be wondering who a transgender person is. Now, when we were growing up, most of us were taught that there are two gender identities, male and female. And we grew up under the assumption of this gender binary. However, there are several gender identities. A transgender person is a person whose gender identity or gender expression differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. Some transgender people who desire medical assistance to transition from one sex to another identify as transsexual. Transgender, often shortened as trans, is an umbrella term. Now, why are we talking about transgender persons and PoSH and their rights? Let me give you some context. For years, trans persons all over the world and in India have faced a lot of difficulties ranging from discrimination, unemployment, lack of educational facilities, homelessness, lack of medical facilities, and rampant physical and sexual abuse. Trans persons are often ostracized, even in their own homes by their own families, ridiculed, demeaned, and harassed in public and private spaces. Furthermore, the prevailing stereotypes about them prevent them from living lives of dignity, safety, and respect. What does the law have to say about the rights of trans persons? So the National Legal Services Authority, or the NALSA versus Union of India ruling in 2014 stated that transgender people were to be treated as a third gender and their rights safeguarded under the Constitution. The Supreme Court also held that sex determination is not just limited to biological sex, but also the innate perception of one's gender. That is, the gender that the trans individual identifies with. The Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act was passed in 2019 to widespread criticism by the trans community. This episode is a two-parter. In the first part, I will be talking to Aparna Mittal, who is the founder of Samāna Centre for Gender Policy and Law, which is India's leading consultancy focused on equality and inclusion for all segments of diversity and with a specialization on gender and LGBTQ inclusion. They can be found at Samāna Centre on Twitter. Aparna and I talk about trans inclusion, organizational policy changes, the law, and how to become effective allies. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Thank you so much, Aparna, for sitting with us and for having this conversation, for agreeing to answer our burning questions. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me, Shweta. It's a pleasure to be associated with SASHA again.
Lovely. It's a pleasure from our end too. So we have had some questions sourced from Team SASHA and from the larger community. And I'm just going to go ahead and ask you those questions, and then we can, take the conversation forward. So
sure.
The first question is around the Act itself. As you know, the Act is gender specific right now. It only talks about, women at the workplace. So do you think we should have a separate law on prevention of sexual harassment for transgender employees? Or should the law be amended so that, transgender persons can be included under the Act? What are your thoughts on this?
Right. So I think a couple of things to start with. I don't think we need a separate law for transgender persons, because I think within the transgender community, transgender is an umbrella word used for a wide spectrum of gender identities. So I don't really believe that, having a separate law will help proper integration into the PoSH policy of the organization. I believe that we have to really make sure our current laws and policies from start to finish are revisited to provide absolute integration of the transgender persons and the trans communities around us, especially in a workplace context. And I think to come to your specific question, Shweta, in terms of how can really it be integrated. So if you see the the PoSH Act uses the word women, and I think there are a lot of judgments now where a transgender person whose preferred identity is a woman or a trans woman, that can, I think, be easily read into the definition of the word woman. I think those judgments have started coming where the word woman has been interpreted broadly to include trans women. So, but there will be other transgender identities, like say trans men, or people who don't want to, who may be from the trans community, but may not be comfortable disclosing their gender identity, or are in the course of transition, where it will always be difficult to kind of use the word woman as it's presently sitting in the PoSH Act to include them. So I would think that instead of looking for a new act, it is, and by the time our own PoSH Act gets amended and moves towards a fully gender neutral act, where it includes all gender identities, whether it's men, somebody who's agender, somebody who's transgender, even within transgender, the wide spectrum of identities that we have. I think till we reach that point of amendment of the PoSH Act, what I think companies can do, and that's most of your audience, is to revisit their own PoSH policy. Because law can gives you the bare minimum, and as long as you're not derogating from the law, you can always add additional benefits or additional aspects which are beneficial towards employees. So I think this is really a clarion call of some sorts, where employees and workplaces can come forward and they can amend their PoSH policy to make it gender neutral, and make sure that not just men, but all trans identities are covered within that scope of gender neutrality as well. And I think just to add to that concept, I think now we also have the new Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act, which clearly says that it puts the reverse onus on the organization now to ensure that there is no discrimination meted out in any aspect of the employee life cycle to a transgender persons. And now they have to equally come up with a clear equal opportunity policy, and they have to clearly set out what aspects are available to a trans person should they join a workplace. So I think if you read the two together, and I don't want to make this hyper technical because there are some restrictions in the PoSH Act presently, but I think if you look at the intention of the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act, which calls for equal equality in policies and benefits, employees can use that as a pivot and actually convert their PoSH policy into a gender neutral PoSH policy. So I think that avenue somehow another legislation has given it to us wherever there was any doubt. Though I think all progressive companies for the past 6-7 years have always had gender neutral policies of some kind.
Yeah. Several organizations that, as far as I know, have had a gender neutral.
Absolutely. Yeah. And at SASHA, you advise, so you come across so many companies, and I think most of them in your experience as well would have gender neutral policy.
Yeah. And several more organizations are also inquiring about making their policies gender inclusive. Even the ones which already have gender neutral policies are talking about amending their policies to make the language even more gender inclusive. That's which I feel is a good trend.
Absolutely. And I think as lawyers, we have to bring in within the realm of legality and within the realm of, keeping it legally kosher, we must look at innovation, and we really must look at how can we revisit a lot of what we have done over the years to really make it inclusive for a wide range of identities, including trans identities.
So our next question is about some myths and misconceptions. So as you know, when it comes to sexual harassment itself, there are a lot of myths and misconceptions that abound. But when it comes to specifically sexual harassment that a transgender person might face, or a trans employee might face in an organization, or without an organization, inside or outside, what are some of those that you have come across?
So I think, unfortunately, the fact that there is rampant sexual harassment and there is rampant sexual harassment of transgender people, it's an unfortunate reality. Now, the question really is that how much have companies stepped forward to first legitimize and recognize trans identities, and second, bring a strong focus on non-harassment or zero tolerance of harassment for transgender persons. So I've really seen both the spectrum. They are a lot of HR folks we meet, they are in complete denial of the fact that there could be a trans person in the workplace, or that they should come forward and hire trans people. And I've seen companies who have transgender people, but they have not looked at their policies. And I think a lot of cases of sexual harassment, if they get reported from a trans person, there will be some kind of want to delegitimize it, or really put the blame on the victim. So in some insidious ways, it follows the same pattern of victim blaming, that you would have behaved in a particular manner, and hence this happened to you. And I think then there is also a few companies, and they are a rare bunch, but thankfully they are there, who have absolutely gender neutral policies, where any person of any gender or sexual orientation, if they feel harassed at the workplace or sexually harassed, they can come forward, and the IC is sensitized and trained at a manner that they understand these issues. They don't have any kind of homophobic mind blocks where they actually think this is not possible, or you would have called for it. They don't talk in those words. They are empathetic, they understand the nuances of sexual harassment, and they come forward and make a decisive, fair and transparent hearing to make sure that wherever justice has to be provided, that's done through the IC machinery as well.
That's so interesting, and it is possible, right? When you talk about, for example, an IC that is, that is aware of its biases and is overcoming, proactive in its learning, it is quite possible. What I tell organizations is also that it doesn't happen in a training. It doesn't happen like all of a sudden you wake up, you realize that there is a training required, and that doesn't bring about sudden change. It does happen over a period of consistent efforts and willingness by the stakeholders, the IC members, the employer. And but when that happens, it's quite very, very good to see the transformation, and
Absolutely.
employees reap the benefits.
And in fact, I must say that, because at Samāna, we do a lot of work on unconscious bias. I think it's important. I completely agree with you that, one training can't change an entire mindset. But I think if we look at the spectrum of complete lack of awareness to awareness towards conscious introspection and then change, I think what trainings and workshops help is that they help help what nobody thought of. You can actually, as a SME, actually go and articulate that and make them think and introspect, and then start changing that. But yes, I completely agree that it doesn't happen overnight. But uh, I think this is something all of us talk about very often, whether we're at SASHA or at Samāna, that the tonality and the behavior of the IC members and how they are really conducting the inquiry, whether they have their own prejudices or mental blocks, that in itself can really damage the inquiry, or can make sure that the inquiry is done in a good way, in a safe way, and people come forward and they can actually share what happened with them. So I really think that apart from a well-drafted policy or training, it's really the IC members who are implementing the IC process. And that kind of, victim blaming, whether it's on women or whether it's on trans persons or whether it's on sexual minorities like the LGBT community, that's something you have to train the IC, and they have to be conscious that they're not carrying that kind of baggage or some kind of prejudices to the inquiry that they're conducting.
So our next question is again regarding the policy. So do you think transgender employees would feel safe? Would it help them if organization policies cover transgender employees? Apart from this, what more do you think needs to be done? Of course,
right. So I think definitely, we work very closely with the trans community, both, who are yet not employed and many who are employed. And I think they want to be treated as equal citizens, which is how it should be. And, that's a very legitimate ask. And not just about the PoSH policy, but I think there's a very genuine and legitimate ask to be integrated into all kinds of processes or policies or benefits that the organization has. And I don't think that, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the transgender community. I'm an ally and I'm here to support them. But to the extent an ally can speak for them, I would say that, as whatever policy it is, as long as it's done well, it is not discriminating, it is implemented properly, I don't think people are going to be hyper fussed or hyper technical actually about where do you make it sit. Do you make it sit in the PoSH policy or somewhere else? I think what we have to see is we have to see the substance over form. It shouldn't be that you have 10 beautifully drafted policies and nothing works. That should also not be the spectrum we're looking at. So I think the ask is very legitimate that please integrate, please mainstream, please make sure we are given the same policies, benefits, infrastructure, etc., that everybody else has, without us having to stand in queue and ask for it. So I think I don't see a big reservation on whether it's integrated in the PoSH policy or in some other policy. I personally think that because the PoSH policy is a comprehensive document talking about sexual harassment and has a lot of things in it which relates to sexual harassment, not just the timeline, but the inquiry process. You may have subtle nuances on, how do you do a cross-examination in matters of sexual crimes or sexual violence. I think to make sure that that comprehensive integrated benefit is available, integrating them into the PoSH policy is the natural and the best way to do it. So that you have one comprehensive code in the organization that talks about sexual harassment, and one doesn't really have to cherry pick or try to put a jigsaw together to really get an avenue for addressal when they have to access it for justice or for any kind of issue.
Yeah. Absolutely. So there is the letter of the law, of course, technically. Then there is the spirit of the law, which talks to intent and
absolutely
how how organizations are willing to make space to create that space.
Absolutely.
I think that is a great point.
I think it all boils down to thought leadership, right? You have to think of somebody as an important part of the workplace, and then be willing to critically look at what you're not doing for them and want to fix it. But if you come from a space of arrogance, or a space of we've given somebody a job, and we've done so much for that person by just giving a job, we don't need to do more, then I think that's really, you are depleting your own talent pool in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is so well said, so simple and yet so profound, and sadly not done in a lot of spaces.
In a lot of spaces, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, unfortunately.
So the next question is regarding, how employees can support each other in the organization, within that infrastructure. How can other employees, by employees I mean co-workers, managers, etc., support their transgender co-workers in helping them feel, included, feel safe, respected, as all employees deserve to?
So I think especially, and I'm going to put this in the context of trans persons, I think there is so much of misunderstanding of trans persons, or so much of stereotyping of trans persons, or so much of apprehension or fear in relation to trans persons, that I think the first thing other employees need to do is make themselves aware. They really have to. Allyship is talked about in really path-breaking words. It's really important to step up as allies. And I think to be an ally, first you have to remove the misinformation. And I know, as I said, the spectrum is moved from lack of awareness to introspection, and then from introspection you move towards proactive change or action. So first you have to remove the tons of garbage, I'm sorry, which keeps coming at it from Bollywood movies or other typical stereotypes or caricaturization of trans identities. Respect them as equal individuals, understand the issues they face at the workplace and what you can do really to create an inclusive workplace. Introspect how we all perpetrate the same gender stereotypes in our personal lives and the way we interact with people, and how do we change ourselves first. It's how casually you use a negative word about a trans person, or about somebody who is from a sexual minority, and a lot of other behavioral issues. First we have to change ourselves, and then I think you have to start contributing to ecosystem change, whether it's policy or it's culture. And I think it comes from a space of being humble enough to say that we want to learn and we want to do something to make some lived experiences better. And it also requires us to recognize our privilege in a lot of ways, and saying that how can we use our privilege as cisgender folks? How can we use that to actually step forward as allies and contribute to making sure that every workplace is an inclusive workplace?
Those are some very good points. And I really like the comprehensive way that you covered in a very short sort of an answer, a very huge, enormous topic. Uh, and so, in closing, Aparna, is there anything that you would like to tell us?
I think I just like to reiterate that look at the world around us. There are such a diverse range of identities across caste, gender, sexual orientation, religion, age. The list is endless, really. And really come forward and enrich your own lives by interacting with more people from diverse, identities. Your own learning and your own contribution will improve. And I think once you start doing that, you won't be doing this because it's a DI agenda. You will be doing it because you will find that excitement or really that commitment within you to make life better for somebody else. And I think that's my only appeal or request to the audience watching us today.
Thank you so much for coming to this, conversation and giving us your insights. This has been really, these are some really good points, and I've learned quite a bit by conversing with you, and I'm sure that our viewers will too. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And I think trans inclusion is a complex area. There's a lot of things to be done. I don't want to oversimplify it in a small conversation. But those of you who are interested, there's a lot to be done. And you're most welcome to come forward and commence that journey.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that was the episode, dear viewers. What do you think? What questions are you left with? Write to us at voice@sashaindia.com and follow us on social media for further updates. In part 2 of this episode, I talk to Vikramaditya Sahai on the topic. See you there.